On the screen with me is Hilary Wenk, who is my esteemed colleague, and she's going to join us for this conversation tonight. And we are delighted to have with us Leslie K. Berry, who is the author of the Newark Minutemen. And we were just saying how wonderful it is that the opportunities that have come from COVID and from the virtual world, that we can be together with her in her home in California, and Hilary and I across the city of Chicago in our own homes. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you.
I was just saying to Leslie as we were letting people in that she's had a remarkable career. Lots of interesting things. You're a screenwriter, you're a best-selling author, you've been an executive producer, you've worked in the toy industry with Turner Broadcasting, with like Mattel and Hasbro and Parker Brothers, but you've also worked with Mindscape video games and with AOL and with Lotus, and now you're an author and a filmmaker, and it's from the book, your creativity, like it shines through. So
thank you.
I wasn't so surprised when I read your bio once I read the book. So tell us about your book. Tell us, like, I know that you're interested in genealogy, and it's clear from the way that you write about your mother and your conversations with your cousins, and you clearly have a close family connection. Tell us about, how did it get started?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And, Chicago is a really interesting place to be talking about this, because even though this story is based on my uncle, who was from Newark, the character that I fictionalized as the hero is based on a character, ironically, from Chicago. And I can talk about that a little bit later. Let me give you a little bit of context first, but I will come back to that. So this is a story that, first of all, it's been so incredible finding this story and feeling like I'm adding a lost part of American history that was lost, and that was directly tied to the rise of fascism in our country and the overall Holocaust and part of Chicago history. And while I was writing this, I really grew to understand some of the things, and I'll talk about them, that America, and we always, we sort of come up against this as a culture, what America knew about the Nazi threat in America before the war. Okay, so this takes place during the Great Depression. So just to first give you a high level of, I don't know if any of you all have read the book at all, but Newark Minutemen is a historical romance. And as Eileen said, it's based on my own family true story that my mom helped me research. And it's a mix of action during the Great Depression, some of the violence and unrest that was going on in our divided country. But I didn't want to just focus on that. I wanted to also, because that to me kind of was an empty story. And so I mixed it with a dramatic romance that's layered over this period. So this is a love story, and it's a star-crossed love story that's doomed for failure, sort of a Romeo and Juliet, or a Jack and Rose, like the Titanic. So it's set in New Jersey in the 1930s, across this little known historical backdrop that was what was the rising German-American Nazi Party in America during the Great Depression, right here on American soil. And it offers this dramatic perspective of one of the biggest untold stories leading up to World War II. And as I said, when I was writing it, I discovered this portrait of the 1930s that revealed this American response to fascism. So how did I discover the story was your question. So so my mom is 95 and she is going strong and remembers every little detail. And about 5 years ago at her 90th, my sisters and I, our goal was to get 90 people to her 90th birthday. And so my mom grew up in Newark, New Jersey. She was the daughter of, immigrants that had come over from Russia in the early 1900s. She had 4 older brothers. So growing up, my sisters and I had heard all these stories from my mom and her brothers and all the cousins so she was born in 1925. So remember, that's right before, the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And we heard all the stories about that. And of course, the war. And there was even a cousin who had escaped from Auschwitz. And another story that we had heard was about her older brother, my Uncle Harry. And Uncle Harry was in the later 1930s, actually. He was a prize fighting boxer. And we always knew that. And we saw the Golden Glove little medal trophy. And we read the newspaper article. But my mom and her cousins started talking about, remember when your brother would come home at 3 o'clock in the morning and your mom would start yelling at him about beating up the Nazis? And I kind of did a double take and I'm like, well, what do you mean beating up the Nazis? You mean when he went to serve in the war? And they're like, no, right here in New Jersey, there were a Nazi organization. They were called the German American Bund. They smuggled in these German Hitler uniforms. They walked down 38th Ave and 5th Ave and every Ave in America with their arms in the air. And they were run by an American Führer, and his name was Führer Fritz Kuhn. And he was an interesting character that he was a real person that took our country and divided it up into 3 sections. From Germany, they called us the colony. And under this hierarchy, there were thousands of cells of these German American Bund training to be soldiers, using guns from our NRA, because back then our NRA would give free guns, using our National Guard to be trained, because back then our National Guard would do some training. They also had some of their own pretty major level coaching and training too from World War I Army people. But anyway, so Fritz Kuhn set up or ran this incredible organization. It was a corporation divided into 6 companies. He had this one company that was this training, recruitment, army type group. He had a newspaper, and he even had a real estate company that bought land across America and built 25 Nazi youth camps across America. And the biggies were in New Jersey and New York, but they were all over. There was one in Chicago. There was every city you can imagine. And that's where they would bring the children to, again, they wear the smuggled in youth uniforms, only speak German, propaganda, learn to fight. And so this whole movement was going on underneath us. You had mentioned I would love to so I'll tell a little bit more about what happened was when I heard the story at my mom's reunion birthday, my cousin and I started talking about it and we got obsessed. And I started doing all this research and I found FBI documents, I found archives, I found diaries, and I'm gonna show you right now. When I saw, there's also this clip of this is real footage, what I'm going to show you. And when I saw this is when I was possessed about bringing this story to the public. And I'll show this, and then I'll tell a little bit about more of the story and sort of what's fictionalized, what's real, and how I brought it all together. But just to give you a flavor of what was really and truly going on, what I'm going to show you is real footage. This is 6 months before the war started. This is in America in our Madison Square Garden. And it was an event that happened on Washington's birthday. So let me share that with you. Bring this. Oops. Let's make this a little bigger here. Okay, so I'm just going to run a little clip of it.
Great.
February 20th, 1939. Just months before Hitler invades Poland and ignites the deadliest war in history, thousands of Nazis gather for a rally at an indoor arena. But this isn't Nuremberg or Berlin. This is Madison Square Garden in New York City.
You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press.
And the man speaking isn't a member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. He's Fritz Julius Kuhn, a U.S. citizen and head of the German-American Bund, or association.
Kuhn wanted a rally to celebrate George Washington's birthday. The first American fascist is what they called him. They signed a contract with Madison Square Garden. Said, okay, we agree. No swastikas, no anti-Semitic signs, none of that stuff. Of course, once the contracts were signed, those agreements went out the window.
This program was produced for the German-American Bund rally.
We love him for the enemies he has made. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fritz Kuhn.
Kuhn then went on to deliver a very, very predictable and very, very typical National Socialist stump speech about racism and the Jewish conspiracy and the communists and how everybody's an enemy and everybody has to be alike.
We, the German-American Bund, organized as American citizens with American ideals and determined to protect ourselves, our homes, our wives and children against the slimy conspirators and the parasite hand of Jewish communism in our schools, our universities, our very homes.
Then, an unemployed plumber tries to silence the American Fuhrer.
So I don't know how many of you had ever seen that before. There's a ton of footage on that online where you can actually watch scenes inside, outside, the whole thing go on. I think there were like 5 different speakers that went on and on to talk about how we're going to make America great and America first and all of those speeches. And what was brilliant about their speeches was that they were wrapping all the Nazi idealism in Americanism. And you probably saw up there, you know, George Washington is standing next to the swastika. And so it was, I have to say, a brilliant positioning of we're going to make our country better by by doing these things and getting rid of some of these people that are ruining our country. So that's sort of the backdrop. And maybe what I'd love to do, I've never done this before, but I think I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to share with you a quick 2-minute trailer that I recently put together for the audiobook of the story, so that you can give an idea now of how I've translated this story into a historical romance. So I'll just play that real quickly.
And all gets red glare, that was her staying in there. April tonight, when a flag was still there. Putting out a light, burning in their eyes, taking all its breath until there's nothing left inside. Spiders marching through, I hear they're coming soon, but I never have to fear, you're the angel in the room. Just don't close your eyes to the black and blue tonight. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives. Just free your mind, at the end we'll see the light. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives. With fire in our hearts, we bid farewell to once, but we are who we are. It's not written in the stars. Just don't close your eyes to the black and blue tonight. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives. Just free your mind, at the end we'll see the light. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives. 37, are we ever coming home? Straight from heaven, I will never let you go. 37, are we ever coming home? Straight from heaven, I will never let you go. Just don't close your eyes to the black and blue tonight. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives. Just free your mind, at the end we'll see the light. We're fighting for our love, but we're running for our lives.
This is a family affair because that's your daughter singing.
Good. Okay, you follow me. Yes, it was our little pandemic project, and my daughter, who loves music, and we were looking for a way for her to sort of kick off her what do you call it? Her online presence. And I said, look, I'm doing the audiobook. Why don't you write the theme song for it? We'll stick it on there. We'll see what happens. And so you know, she's definitely an artist. So it was a beautiful experience, but we definitely had our tension.
You're a mother and a daughter, I expect.
It wasn't tension. It was more of a roller coaster. I had to like go the roller coaster. Let me put it that way with her. And so finally I said, I don't know the difference between this note and that note. Why don't we bring in somebody else? So anyway, it was a beautiful experience. And in fact, my other daughter helped design the cover of the book. And so not only is it me working with my daughters, but it's my mom, and then me with the story, and then them. And so it's been really this incredible multi-generational experience. But
fabulous.
Thank you. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the story. And as you know now, it's set during this Great Depression era. And for those of you who know history, that was a very fertile ground for alternatives to democracy, right? Because nobody had jobs and men were losing their who they were. And we had sort of this triple threat going on. We had this economic crisis, and then we had these aggressive dictators, and then we had this divided America. And so people were looking for alternatives for this hopelessness. And they were looking to the left, by the way, not just, you know, so on one end was communism, and hey, maybe communism is the answer. And then we had the middle, which was FDR, which a lot of people called socialism, where the government was taking care of a lot. And then, of course, on the right was fascism. And what happened was this shadow party filled this great divide that was this Hitler satellite called the German-American Bund. And so this is the story about a forgotten resistance group of fighters that were organized by the mob and the government to defend our country from this threat. And so what happened was we were this divided country, and a lot of the citizens in our country, the last thing we wanted was to go back to war, because a lot of them had just gotten out of World War I. So I forget the numbers, but like 85% of the people did not want to enter another war. So you had that going on. And then you had First Amendment rights. So even though blatantly in front of us, these guys were organizing and rallying and having newspapers and all of this, as a government, we couldn't do anything. And we were so divided that we were divided kind of like we are now down the middle, but we were also divided. Even our Supreme Court was divided. So there were we were like how many divided? What we had back then, we had, I think, 4 and 4 on our Supreme Court. Maybe we had a 5th, but for some reason, I feel like we were divided right down the middle. So we couldn't even pass laws to say, in the meantime, we know there's a threat going on. We need laws to bound freedom of speech. It was a very complicated time. So our government's hands were tied. So what did they do? Well, who has power in the country at the time, right? Let's put it in context. In 1929, stock market crashes. Everybody loses their money except who?
The mafia.
The mafia. Why? Who knows why?
Well, they were making money illegally.
Right. And they weren't putting it in banks, right? It was the whole bootlegging in the 20s. So then they're the ones who have money. So of course, money brings power. They would put elected officials in office. The government comes to them and says, and they went to Meyer Lansky, who was the head of the Jewish mob, and they said, look, we will pay you to help us with these organized events and activities that are going on. And Meyer Lansky said, you don't need to pay me, you just look the other way and let us take care of it the way we need to take care of it. They said, all right. So Meyer went over to his buddy in New Jersey, Longies Wilman, who was the head of the mob there, who was this very charismatic, like people always ask me, because this is in development to be a movie, they say, in the movie, who would you want? Robert Downey Jr. to me looks exactly like Longies Wilman, a young Longies Wilman. So he's my dream for Longies Wilman. But that's the character that you had there. And if you ask people like my mom and her cousins or anybody, what was Longie like? They're like, oh, like even though he was a mob king, they were like in the neighborhood, they were like, we loved Longie. He was our Robin Hood. He set up the soup kitchens. My mom's cousin was his barber. He helped some of the family come here, get out of Germany and from over there. And so, you know, and he gave all the boys jobs, right? Anyway, Meyer went over to Longie. Longie ran the boxers at the time. At the time, Jewish boxers, there was a huge, I think the quote is, there were more Jewish boxer champions in the 20s and 30s than any other cultural ethnic group. So of course, boxing comes with gambling. Longie ran the boxers because there's all the gambling behind that. So Meyer went to Longie and said, look, you have this organization of boxers. It's like a network. We can, if we need 1 or 10 or 100, we can call them up at a minute's notice. We'll pay them $100 every time they go out. And of course, you know, young boys back then did not a lot of Jewish boys, not a lot of opportunity to even go to school or make money. It was a great, easy night of $100. And so Longie brought in, actually hired one of his veteran boxers. His name was Nat Arno. And he said, I want you to train these guys to be ready to go out. And that's how this whole resistance sort of formed. And that was my Uncle Harry was one of those boxers. Now in the story actually follows Harry's friend Yale. Mm-hmm. And I want to really talk about him for a second because he is the one that's from Chicago, or is based on the character from Chicago. So again, just to bring it all up again, what you have is this story that follows this Jewish boxer, Yale Newman. He's part of this group of boxers called the Newark Minutemen that's now organized by the Jewish mob and our government to go up against the German-American Bund. And Yale is recruited to go undercover for this resistance in New Jersey and become what was called, it was like the SS, it was called the OD, it was like the inner circle that protected the Fuhrer. Along the way, Yale falls in love with the daughter of the leader of the German-American Bund. So that's when you then have this star-crossed love coming together. So let me talk about Yale a little bit. So in real life, so this story mostly takes place in 1938. In 1936, there's a really interesting story from Chicago that I came across as I was researching this. And there were 2 brothers. They were John and James Metcalf. John was a newspaper man for the Chicago Daily Times. His brother James worked for the FBI, was part of the Dillinger shootout. And the 2 of them, the editor of the Times at the time, the Daily Times, and the 2 of them came up with this scheme to, for 6 months, for the 2 of them to go undercover, infiltrate the German-American Bund, and find out as much as they could about what was going on, and then write a 14-page series about what was really and truly going on in this party, and were they a threat to America? Well, they ended up doing this, and I found the newspaper articles. That was all very interesting. But as I was, and this, I used me that this is at the very beginning, so I'm sorry, I'm answering it now. One of the ways I develop my historical characters that are sometimes fictionalized is I use ancestry. So not only do I go for my own family, but I create the families of my characters. So I understand who they are, their brothers, where they lived, what jobs they had, some of the dynamics in their life. I don't know if any of you all have ever done that kind of research, but it's amazing what you find out. Anyway, I was creating the Metcalf family tree. And in mice type at the bottom, John's son wrote this little note that all of John's diaries were in archives in the Hoover Institute. Well, the Hoover Institute is right up here by me. I'm in California. It's at Stanford University. I didn't really know what it was beyond, I know they host major people and political people, but they also have an archive. So I became a member, and I went down to the Hoover Institute, and they pat you down, and they don't let you take in, they have a locker, you have to drop off everything, and it's underground, so it's all that kind of mystique. Anyway, I had no idea what I was going to find. I brought a friend of mine who had been, he's been editor for the San Francisco Chronicle, as well as the Philadelphia paper. And he's like, Leslie, this is going to be a mess. Don't get your expectations too high. I said, okay, fine. So I went over and I got the first box. There are 12 boxes. You can only take one at a time. And I bring over the first box to my friend. I put it down. I go over to get the second box. I come back and he goes, we have hit the mother lode. He goes, this is unbelievable. He said, the way John's notes were so organized, every little piece of paper, you can tell that there was even things like a restaurant receipt that he wrote on the back of that was stuck in, and you could tell that he was probably like sneaking away, writing his notes and putting it all together. And so anyway, I found this incredible information. I tracked down John's son, who's like 80 years old now. He lives in Hollywood, California. And we talked, he shared stuff with me. We talked, he said, use it. And so some of the scenes in my book are, because one of my goals for this book was to make it as authentic as possible. Everything from the characters to how my mom took out the trash. It was just this thing about my goal. And so one of the scenes in there is when Yale is being initiated into this, what they called the OD. It's a German word, which was like the SS. There's a whole ritual that goes on. They go in a U and then this U and anyway, he had documented that whole scene. And so that whole scene, for instance, is in my book, as well as other scenes as well. But it gave me this ability to add this richness of authenticity. And by the way, to me, danger and scariness of what was going on during the times. So that's the sort of the story and the background. Now, one thing I should, for those of you who haven't read it, Eileen, it sounds like you at least started it, or did you?
Oh, no, I've read it.
Read it, okay. So one thing I did that people fought me about, and this was my first novel, and I may have done some things differently, but one thing I did was I wrote it through the eyes of 4 narrators rather than third person. And a lot of, especially us older people, are not used to that. Younger people, like that's how Hunger Games was written. That's how a lot of the younger millennial generation books are. So anyway, I was really determined because my four narrators, so basically you've got the hero and the heroine, Yale, and the girl, Krista, and you have the Fuhrer, Fritz Kuhn, and then you also have the mob king, Longies Willman. And so, you know, we're talking about, depending on whose shoes you are in, there's two bad guys here, right? There's the Nazis, which we know the punchline there. So we might have we might think they're the really bad guys, but it was also the mob, the mafia, and they're bad guys too. And what I wanted of myself, and what I felt I wanted to give the reader was this like empathy for the bad and the good sides, so that they could understand the fears on both sides and the wickedness and the kindness. And through these four eyes, I wanted the reader to be able to examine why America closed their eyes. Because you might say, like, why the heck did half our country, or a portion of our country, think they wanted fascism for America? I wanted to try to give a flavor of, well, maybe why. And I think Krista is probably my real voice for that, the girl Krista, because she is torn. She is the daughter of the German-American bun. And she's a kid, you know, she's 17 years old. And of course she's going to believe what her parents believe, and she's going to believe what they teach her in camp, but she's an American too. And so where does she start? Where does the conflict in herself come in? And I tried to create some of that, layered on top of the conflict of a relationship, layered on top of the conflict of our world that was going on at the time.
I felt like you created very real people. Nobody is all black and all white. There is no, there's nobody who's like all good and all bad. And I felt like each one of them came across as, I know that Kuhn and that Longy were real people, but they came across that way. And you could understand, look, the money, that $100 that, he paid the boxers, that was being made illegally. And there were people, he was also dealing in prostitution and all kinds of things. So like, he was a hero in that community, but in the broader Jewish community, those mobsters were not beloved because it was felt that they gave the Jewish community a bad name. So I felt like what you had created was very real people. What I wonder is, so you had all these guys who were boxers, you had all of them working, for the mob. There were Minutemen. Like I did some research myself because I was interested, and like in many cities, big cities, you had people. If they weren't called Minutemen, they were doing much the same kind of work. How is it that your uncle, who you knew, he never talked about this? Like he talked about the fact that he was a boxer, but like this was a big part of what he did as a young person, and he never talked about it. And how is it that it's never talked about? Like it's not taught in a, it's like, how is it that they just disappeared?
It is such a great question. And I have still not discovered the exact answer. I have my theories. I've talked to, one of the incredible things is through writing this book, I've actually been able to connect to the sons and daughters of not only the Minutemen, but a lot of the mafia. I've connected with Meyer Lansky's grandson and Longy's stepson and so forth. And I always ask them that question. And the theories are, so in general first, and then I'll talk about my uncle, one answer is, well, you know, World War II upstaged anything that could have happened here, and that is true. But I still don't completely buy that. I mean, this is part of American history. This is the seeds of fascism. If anybody wants to really understand, yes, maybe it started in the 20s, but certainly it was formalized in the 30s. Radio had a lot to do with broadcasting and bringing different groups together for this one message. And again, people sometimes say it was such a minority. There's arguments whether there was, you know, 5,000 or 25,000 or a million people. It didn't matter. They were a minority and there was a momentum, and sometimes minorities have a strong momentum. So anyway, number one, I don't buy that, you know, World War II overshadowed it, even though a lot of these boys went off and some of these German Americans went off. You know, the second theory is that, well, you know, this was the government asking our mob for help. And if you research it, it's really hard to find anything. I mean, I found a couple little Jewish telegram papers about, you know, Nat Arno was arrested last night. He was a Minuteman, and you know, so-and-so was going to shoot him and all that kind of stuff. Most of the rest of the story is anecdotes. I mean, talking to my mom, her family, talking to my cousin and I, actually, Weequahic High School is the big Jewish high school in Newark. And they have a huge alumni association. And when we were researching this, we sent out a message and said, if anybody's fathers or uncles or brothers or whatever were a Minuteman, will you send us stories? Well, we got all these stories, but they've never been published. So probably a big part of it was that it was the mob, and you know, it wasn't like in the newspaper or on the radio. The third kind of reason was that the German-American Bund, after that night at the Garden that you saw, that was in February. By that fall, Fritz Kuhn, the head of the Bund, was in jail, not for what he was doing, but they got him like Al Capone on, you know, fraud and taxes. And once he was gone, he was a very charismatic character. The organization started fracturing. Because of that night at the Garden, there were 200,000 people outside. There was this awareness that went up. A movie came out by Warner Brothers. It was called the Warner Brothers back then, called Confessions of a Nazi Spy. All of a sudden, that raised awareness. And then that fall was when Hitler marched on Poland. And so, you know, it's a combination of those things. But you ask a very good question, and I have never found the clear answer. In terms of my uncle, so my Uncle Harry, and my sister and I were just talking to some people the other night about this. He was this sort of imposing 6'4" guy that was a prize fighting heavyweight boxer who was then a military policeman in the war and then a policeman, but he was a gentle giant and he didn't talk about much. And he always he told us about his boxing, but he didn't talk about that. And I've met again I'm very close actually with two daughters of two of the featured boxers in the story. And they were like, God, my dad used to talk a little bit about it, but now I see the whole picture. Like they would never talk about the whole picture. And I think, so saying all that, I think if I had to give you an answer, I would say it was with the mafia and it was underground and you just didn't talk about those kinds of things.
Robert had a question, if that's okay. Robert, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
please do.
Sure. I wanted to know, and you sort of already answered it, how many Bund members there were across the U.S. And it sounds like it's really difficult to determine that.
Yeah. So the numbers you hear are, the people that you. So it's funny, when I was doing this book, I read both sides. So I read this one book that was sort of from a Bund perspective, and the other side too. So the numbers are several thousand or whatever, but just you and I, when did you get to watch the video that was up before from Madison Square Garden? So, okay, in Madison Square Garden that night, there were 25,000 people. We know that wasn't all. So we know there was at least 25,000. There was and we know that these groups were in every single city in America. We also know that other fascist groups, they were all trying to join together. And again, it was radio that was bringing them together. There was a mailing list the FBI found of 1 million people, not necessarily saying there was 1 million in the Bund, but there was a mailing list to 1 million people. So even if it were, I don't know, 50,000, it's got to be double what was in that Madison Square Garden, 50, 100,000. There was a momentum behind it too. And, we've all lived through the past year here, and we've seen what momentum can do in some of these extremist groups. So I don't care if it's only 1,000, a couple thousand, if it's enough to create a momentum and get the attention of the media, I think we should open our eyes.
This is all very interesting for me because my father had talked not much, but a little bit about how he went down in Chicago to a Bund meeting to break things up a little bit.
Absolutely. There's a great article, because before I was going to do this, I liked, I did some research on Chicago and the Bund. There is a great article, and I can send it to you all if you all want to send it on or share or whatever. But the Bund so Fritz Kuhn was actually, originally he was originally from Germany. He went to Mexico, then he went to Detroit. He was an engineer. And some people actually sort of understate him. They say he was sort of this bumbling guy. He had his master's in engineering. He was a chemist. He worked for Henry Ford, and we know some of Henry Ford's political angles, right? And he was charismatic. And so Detroit is where, there was some activity, and then Chicago was a big activity. And so I forget who asked it, but so it's interesting because there were what was called Minutemen groups all over. The Newark Minutemen were this particular group that were organized in a organized way. Some of the other groups actually got out of hand. And Eileen, like you said before, sometimes, and as we've witnessed the past year, sometimes when groups get out of hand, they get a bad name. Mm-hmm. And that's what started happening. And that's why Meyer Lansky went to Longy and said, hey, we got to have some rules, like don't hit above the head or whatever it is. Tell your Newark Minutemen, these are the rules. Right. And so that's the difference between the Newark Minutemen and some of these other Minutemen. And then, by the way, there were other risings. There are different stories on the West Coast. I don't know if you all have ever heard of the story, like I think it's called Nazis in Hollywood or Hitler in Hollywood or something like that, that there was a group out on the West Coast of German fascists. I don't know if they were Bund or one of those organizations. And it was a little earlier than my story, but their idea was they were going to kill all of the movie heads that were all Jewish, the Warner Brothers, Charlie Chaplin, I think FDR was even on that list. And there was a couple Jewish people that went into that organization undercover and created so much confusion so that it couldn't be pulled off. But it was going on all over the country, and the powers in Germany, they called us the colony, and they considered us a Hitler satellite. And whether Hitler thought he was going to take over our country or not, he certainly thought that we were going to be kind of working. We were not going to destroy him. And so during the 30s, there are stories, and it later came out with the FBI's of he would send spies to take pictures of both of our coasts, all of our naval yards, all of our factories. German Americans would be put in our factories. The ones that were spies would send information back. I mean, it's amazing, the stories. And I'm talking before the war. This was set in the stage. And one thing, in fact, that Hitler and the organization didn't like about Fritz Kuhn was that because Fritz Kuhn was so charismatic, he thought he was getting too much attention. And he's like, calm down, I'm not ready to wake up America yet. And so there was a little bit of it was interesting. People used to say, is he telling him what to do, or is Fritz Kuhn just doing it himself? It was certainly a combo from the moment in 1933, the people that were involved in the German Fascist Party here, which was originally called the Friends of Germany in 1933, that turned into the German American Bund in 36. But while it was very aggressive early on, by 36, they were saying, we're not quite ready to rile up America. Let's, get all the way to England first. And then.
And I understand that Hitler used Jim Crow as a model for a lot of the things that he did in Europe.
That's true. And some of the eugenics as well. That's true. That is true.
So proud.
Yeah.
But the sad part is, because the story doesn't get told, so, everything old is new again. And so because the story has not really been told broadly, we have a whole generation where, you read surveys are done of young adults in the United States. Some ridiculous number, 40% had never heard of the Holocaust. If we don't tell the story, and if we don't get it out there, it could happen again. And I mean, we look at Charlottesville this year, and look what happened at the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
Those glaring examples.
For sure.
Examples.
I mean, two things you say that are really interesting that I've sort of discussions I've had is that, this story, and hopefully it will become a movie, so it'll be more mass to the masses. I do think the younger generation would grip this story because it's younger people, it's America, and it is a way to say, oh my gosh, okay, I kind of feel what this could have become, and now I get what, like there were horrible things going on, and those things could be here, and I can relate to it. And that is one of my hopes, that it will, like I don't know if we talked about this, but I actually wrote the screenplay first and sold the movie first, then wrote the book. And when I was writing the screenplay, I made my 17-year-old son read it. And I thought, he was going to be like, I don't want to read. And he's like, wow, I really like this. And I said, you do? Why? And he goes, because I never learned this. And I was like, okay, it's going to hook the young people. This is really good. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I think you said that's really interesting is what's similar is the fears that drive the extreme right. I think the fears are the same in that back then, while you might not say, you know, there is a Hitler, certainly we've seen there's a movement, whoever that's being led by or whatever. So there's a movement. And the fears back then was that, you know, the white race was going to disappear. We can't let that happen. That is still the fear today.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and it's not that people are like, oh, we're not gonna have jobs because the immigrant, you know, of immigration. There's a group of people that really think whites are going to become extinct, and that's kind of an odd fear to deal with, because you can't say, oh no, look, we'll lower taxes, we'll give you a job, don't worry about the immigrants. It's like, I don't want to say they, but there's an extremist group that are like, we're going to disappear if we don't do something. And it's a worldwide fear. It's not just United States. We deal with sort of a different grouping of people, but there's a great movie that was based on a true story called July 11th. I don't know if you all remember. In 2011 in Norway, yeah, there was an extremist. He was a lone extremist that bombed the building, the state capitol, and then went and killed all the children of the politicians on this island. And I think his thing is he's killed over more since World War II. I think he's killed more, I don't know if it's people or children or whatever. Anyway, that movie that's based on a true story, there's a guy that comes on and says, look, and he was an extremist as well. He said, this guy, we were not working as a group, but I will tell you that our group, which is an extreme right group, has a fear of, so over in Norway, the fear is more Muslim immigrants and that area of the world. And he said, there's a worldwide movement going on where we are not going to let the whites become extinct. So we kind of look through American eyes and say, oh my gosh, look what's going on in America. This is the whole entire world. And by the way, you talk about that we have a generation that doesn't know about the Holocaust. I have a friend in India. They're not taught the Holocaust. It's a big country. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that part of the world, you know, either they're not taught about the Holocaust or they're taught it in a different way.
Right. We don't think about it. We don't, you know, we think about it from our American perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But in India, they basically lived through their own Holocaust when the, you know, British came in the early 1800s to, take over their country. So I wonder if they learned about that history.
They do. They definitely do. Right. I don't think, I'm not sure with the Harry and Markle interview, if they were supporting that or not.
Robert was asking if the name of the movie will be the same as the book.
It's a great question. I mean, what I've been able to do, and not on purpose, but after I wrote the screenplay and sold that, I kept the rights to the book, not even really planning to write the book. But what happens in Hollywood is when you sell your story, everybody who touches it wants it to be their own, and then it's not yours anymore. So I'm like, okay, I want to get this legacy down, and for my mom and for bigger reasons too. So I ended up writing the book, and I've been very lucky in how it's taken off in, you know, across the country in every city. And so I hope there's some brand awareness. You know, am I 100% tied to that name? No, but I think it has some, it's the working name at least. So I'm not sure, but you know how Hollywood is. They do what they want because they're union.
What's easier, writing a book, writing the screenplay?
Wow. Well, okay. So it's interesting. The way you write a screenplay is it's a page a minute. So if it's a 90-minute movie, it's 90 pages. Okay. And if you've ever seen a screenplay, it's like if the paper's this big, you only have to write this big, right? So it's a lot less words. And then, you know, your book's like 350 pages. So it's a lot more words.
You have to develop the characters in a book.
That's right, exactly. So what was so hard? So writing the screenplay, is I did the timeline. I used some other models of character arc of a love story, and I got a lot of help. So that kind of, while it moved all around a lot, to me, that was not hard. Once I had all the research, it kind of just came out. The book, I thought, okay, I have the timeline, I have the characters, this is going to be easy. Oh my God. I mean, I would write drafts of the book and people were like, this sounds like a screenplay. I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't get it. And so finally somebody said, and I knew this because I've written books before, I just have never published them before, and I've read tons of books, but people would say, you have to make your characters think. What do you mean, think? Here they are, they're acting, you know, because in a screenplay, you have to show everything, right? He picked up the pen, it was red. You don't think, oh, could this be the future? So I was working with this one editor. I think I went through 3 people. I was like, I don't get it. I don't get it. Finally, this one woman said to me, she said, go, you have Hunger Games? I said, yeah. She goes, go get it. I said, okay. So I went and she goes, read me the first page. And I don't know if you all have ever read Hunger Games, but Katniss, you know, it starts with Katniss turns and feels the cold sheets. She knows her sister is gone and she starts thinking. I'm like, oh, I get it, thinking. So I was like, so for me, for this particular project, writing the book was so much harder because I guess it was already branded in my head and I had to make that transition. But I had so much information in my head, and probably maybe part of the hardest part too was not making it sound like a history book, like making the history invisible. Mm-hmm. That was hard. And that what helped that also was writing in first person perspective. Through these 4 narrators. So, you know, they couldn't sit there and blurb off the, they
weren't reading the news. It wasn't
exactly. But I do have drafts where like I quote from the newspaper from Crystal Knox. So, and those are so boring now that I look back at them. So Robert, I think for me, for this project, writing the book was a lot harder, even though it's so weird because I already had the story.
Well, it's a great story. And so we're going to look really forward to the movie.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I hope that we'll get a chance to present that as part of the film festival.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Super. That would be super. And one of these days I'm going to come down on Chicago and we'll have a live thing. And so
that would be wonderful. If you're coming to Chicago, we want to know.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And please, with this group, feel free to share my email if anybody has any questions or wants to be an extra in the movie or whatever you want. And I do have a website with, there you go, Robert. I do have this website that's got some of the backstory if you're interested in more of the real, story or pictures or whatever. And that's NewarkMinutemen.com. So the name of the book and .com. Newark is in Newark, New Jersey, NewarkMinutemen.com. But anyway, if you all, feel free to share my email if you would like.
Thank you. Are you going to write any more books based on your mother's stories?
Well, I God, somebody asked me that this morning. Writing the book has become so much easier than marketing it, especially during a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So I kind of want to finish doing this one. I have some ideas. I have a prequel idea and a sequel idea for this. One of the areas that fascinates me is one of the ways that they proved that the German Nazis were tied to the American Nazis was through the money trail.
Yeah.
And so there was this several banks, but Chase Bank, the highest levels, Chase Bank was very instrumental in getting money from German Americans here, sending it back for the war effort there. And so I have sort of a crime drama idea for that, and a prequel. And then I have another idea, but this one is, I feel like I need to give this, the paperback hasn't even been out for a full year, right? It's the ebook came out in April, but the paperback came out in October. So I feel like I got to give it a good year, hit every city, every JCC and major city in America. So at least I get a little bit of the story out there. And then maybe do another one.
Well, we'll look forward to, we'll be watching for either the prequel, the sequel, both of them, and definitely the movie. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Okay, thank you all so much.
You stay safe.